The desert stretched endless and cruel, painted in shades of rust and bone under a merciless August sun. Heat waves shimmered like ghosts above the hardpan, distorting the horizon until earth and sky became one wavering line of torment. In this wasteland where even the buzzards flew high to escape the furnace below, something moved that shouldn't have been there. A wagon, broken, abandoned, its canvas cover flapping, like a dying bird's wing in the sparse wind that offered no relief, only the taste of dust and despair. And tied to its splintered side, two small forms that the desert had already begun to claim. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The twins couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Jacob and Samuel Morrison, though. Neither could speak their own names anymore. Their lips were cracked like dried creek beds, their small bodies motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of ribs that showed too clearly through torn cotton shirts. The rope that bound them to the wagon wheel was rough hemp, the kind used for tethering livestock, wrapped tight around their wrists until the circulation had nearly stopped. Their hair, once blonde like prairie grass, was now matted with dust. And something darker. Blood from where the rope had chafed their skin raw. Their eyes, when they managed to open them, stared at nothing with the glassy emptiness of children who had screamed until their voices gave out, who had cried until no tears remained. The wagon itself told a story written in violence and haste. Bullet holes punctured the canvas in neat, deliberate patterns. The wooden sides bore scorch marks from torches. Personal belongings lay scattered in the sand like broken prayers. A woman's hand mirror reflecting the pitiless sky. A Bible with pages torn and fluttering. A child's wooden horse with 3 legs, painted red and blue, now faded to the color of old blood. Beside the wagon, 2 graves had been hastily dug in the hardpan. Shallow things, barely deep enough to keep the coyotes away for more than a night. Wooden crosses marked them, made from wagon slats and bound with the same rope that now held the children. The names carved into the wood were already beginning to blur in the sand-laden wind. Thomas Morrison, age 34, and Sarah Morrison, age 29. But it was what surrounded the graves that revealed the true horror. Moccasin prints in the sand, dozens of them, leading to and from the wagon in purposeful patterns. Apache signs carved into a nearby Joshua tree, warnings and claims marked deep into the bark. This hadn't been a random attack by desperate renegades. This had been calculated, planned, a message written in smoke and suffering. The children had been left alive deliberately. Jacob, the older twin by mere minutes, had tried to protect his brother. Even now, barely conscious, his bound hand stretched toward Samuel, fingertips almost touching. His shirt bore tear stains that had long since dried to salt, and his knees were scraped raw from trying to drag himself closer to the meager shade the wagon provided. On his small wrist, a braided leather bracelet his father had made him, a simple thing that spoke of Saturday mornings spent learning to work with his hands, of a man who had tried to teach his son the value of patience and craft. Samuel, smaller and frailer, had given up the fight earlier. His head lolled against the wagon wheel, blonde hair falling across a face that should have been round with childhood, but was now gaunt with dehydration and terror. In his small fist, he still clutched a corn-husk doll their mother had sewn for him, a warrior figure with a feathered headdress, now torn and pathetic in his weakening grip. The irony wasn't lost on the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and death in equal measure. The sun had been their enemy for 3 days now. 3 days since the attack that had taken everything they knew and left them tethered like sacrificial offerings to appease some angry god of the wasteland. The rope burns on their wrists had festered in the heat, attracting flies that the children no longer had the strength to brush away. Their skin, once pale and protected beneath bonnets and long sleeves, was now burned red and beginning to blister around them. The evidence of their family's final moments lay scattered like accusations. Flowers spilled from a torn sack had turned to paste in the morning dew, then hardened to concrete in the day's heat. Broken pottery crunched underfoot, pieces of their mother's good china that had somehow survived the journey from Ohio only to be shattered here, in this place where hope came to die. A daguerreotype lay face down in the sand, its silver surface reflecting nothing but emptiness. When the wind occasionally lifted it, it revealed the formal portrait of a family dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas Morrison with his careful mustache and serious eyes. Sarah Morrison with her hair pinned in the latest fashion, and between them, two small boys grinning gap-toothed smiles at the camera. A family that had believed in manifest destiny, in the promise of California gold, in the notion that good Christian folk could make a life anywhere God saw fit to lead them. They had been wrong. The attack had come at dawn 3 days ago. The Morrison family had been part of a larger wagon train, but they had fallen behind when their youngest ox had gone lame. Pride and stubborn self-reliance had convinced Thomas Morrison that they could catch up, that a man with strong arms and stronger faith could handle anything the territory might throw at him. He had sent the others on ahead, promising to meet them at Willow Springs. The Apache war party had been watching them for hours before they struck. Silent as shadows, they had observed this family's vulnerability, their isolation, their foolish confidence in traveling alone through territory that belonged to neither Washington politicians nor California dreamers. When they finally attacked, it had been swift and surgical, not the wild, screaming charge that penny novels described, but the calculated efficiency of hunters who knew their prey. Thomas Morrison had died trying to reload his rifle, the powder horn spilling its contents across the sand as an arrow found its mark. Sarah Morrison had fallen clutching her sons, her final act an attempt to shield them with her own body. But the warriors hadn't come for the children's lives. They had come for something else entirely. The twins had been forced to watch as their parents' belongings were sorted through with methodical precision. Not looted, examined. Documents were studied, personal items weighed and considered. The family Bible was open to the genealogy page where births and deaths were recorded in careful script. Maps were unfolded and studied before being cast aside. This hadn't been about horses, or guns or supplies. This had been about sending a message. When the war party had finally departed, they left the children tied to the wagon wheel with enough water for perhaps one day, positioned where they could see their parents' hastily dug graves. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who claim what isn't theirs. This is the price of your people's arrogance. Now, as the third day's heat reached its merciless peak, the children existed in that liminal space between life and death. Their small bodies had begun the process of shutting down, conserving what little remained of their strength for the most essential functions. They no longer called for their mother. They no longer wept. They simply endured, minute by minute, breath by shallow breath. Jacob stirred slightly as a shadow passed overhead. A buzzard, circling lower now, patient but hopeful. His cracked lips moved in what might have been prayer, or might have been delirium. "Mama," he whispered, the word barely audible, carrying on the wind like smoke from a dying fire. The desert had seen this before. It would see it again. Children died here with regularity, from disease, from accident, from the simple, brutal mathematics of survival in a land that cared nothing for innocence or intention. But these children carried something more than just their own small tragedy. They carried the weight of their people's presumption, the accumulated guilt of treaties broken and promises made in bad faith. They were symbols now, whether they lived or died. Proof that the old ways still held power, that the spirits of this land could still exact a price from those who tried to take without asking, who confused conquest with belonging. The wind picked up slightly, setting the wagon's torn canvas to snapping like a prayer flag in some heathen temple. Dust swirled around the small forms tied to the wheel, and for a moment, They seemed to flicker like mirages themselves, there and not there, real and imagined, alive and already part of the desert's long memory of loss. In his weakening grip, Samuel's cornhusk doll seemed to move slightly, the feathered headdress stirring in the breeze. The warrior figure his mother had sewn with such care now watched over him with button eyes, a guardian made of corn silk and love, powerless against rope and sun and the vast indifference of the sky. The desert waited. Patient as stone, merciless as time itself. It had swallowed armies and dreamers alike. 2 small children would be nothing more than another secret buried in the sand. Another story the wind would whisper to the sagebrush and the circling hawks. But sometimes, in places where suffering had carved deep grooves into the very bedrock of existence, the desert chose to reveal its secrets rather than bury them. Sometimes it offered witnesses instead of graves, and in the shimmering distance, barely visible through the heat haze, something moved that wasn't wind or shadow or death, coming to collect what it was owed. Something was coming across the wasteland, steady and deliberate, cutting through the mirage like a blade through silk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The figure that emerged from the heat haze moved like smoke-given substance, each step deliberate and silent, despite the rocky ground beneath moccasined feet. At first glance, he might have been a mirage himself, tall, lean, carved from the same red stone as the desert cliffs. But as the distance closed, the shimmer resolved into flesh and bone, into a man who belonged to this wasteland as surely as the Joshua trees and the patient vultures overhead. His name was Running Bear, though he had not answered to it in over 2 years. The white settlers called him Charlie Crow Feather when they bothered to call him anything at all, unable or unwilling to wrap their tongues around the sounds that truly named him. But names were just breath and meaning, and both had grown scarce in his world lately. He was perhaps 30 summers old, though the deep lines around his dark eyes and the careful way he carried himself suggested a man who had lived through more seasons of hardship than years of peace. His face bore the geography of violence, a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, white against copper skin, where a cavalry saber had tried to take his life and settled for marking him instead. Another scar, smaller but deeper, curved beneath his right eye like a crescent moon. The gift of a mountain lion that had disputed his right to hunt in the high country. His hair hung long and black, streaked with premature silver that caught the light like threads of metal woven through midnight. 3 eagle feathers hung from a leather cord at his left temple, each one earned through acts of courage that his people would remember long after his bones had returned to the earth. But it was his eyes that marked him as different from other men. They held depths that seemed to reflect not just the present moment, but all the moments that had led to it, as if he carried the memory of his people's entire journey carved into his gaze. Running Bear wore the clothes of a man caught between worlds. Buckskin leggings, soft as water and silent as prayer, met a cotton shirt that had once been military blue but was now faded to the color of storm clouds. Around his waist, a wide belt held both a traditional knife with a handle carved from elkhorn and a Colt revolver he had taken from a dead soldier 3 winters past. On his feet, moccasins sewn by his grandmother's hands before she walked the spirit trail, their beadwork telling the story of his clan's migration from the mountains to the desert floor. He traveled alone, which was unusual for an Apache warrior, but not surprising for a man who had learned that solitude was often safer than companionship. His horse, a paint mare named Spotted Wind, picked her way through the rocky terrain with the sure-footed confidence of an animal born to this country. Her coat was dusty white marked with patches of brown that looked like handprints against fresh snow, and her intelligence showed in the way she moved her ears, constantly listening for sounds her rider might miss. Running Bear had been tracking the war party for 4 days now, following a trail that led through some of the most unforgiving country in the territory. Not because he wanted to join them, those days were behind him now, but because their path had intersected with something else he was hunting. Raiders, white men this time, who had taken horses from a settlement near Fort Collins and left behind. More than horse theft in their wake. A woman had been killed and her children taken. The territorial government was offering a bounty that would buy supplies for the hard winter ahead. But as Spotted Wind crested a low ridge and the broken wagon came into view below, Running Bear felt something shift in his chest like a stone settling to the bottom of a deep well. He had seen this tableau before, in variations that haunted his dreams. Broken families scattered across the desert like seeds that would never grow. The endless cycle of violence that fed on itself, growing stronger with each generation that learned to hate before they learned to love. He dismounted 50 yards from the wagon, his movements fluid and unconscious as breathing. Spotted Wind stood where he left her, ground-tied by training and trust, her nostrils flaring as she tested the wind for the sense of death and danger. Running Bear approached on foot, reading the story written in tracks and blood and scattered belongings with the same fluency another man might read a newspaper. The moccasin prints told him which of his people had done this. Iron Wolf's band, warriors he had once called brothers before the treaties failed and the choices grew too hard to bear. The bullet holes in the wagon spoke of panic and desperation, shots fired too quickly by a man who had never learned to fight for his life. The positioning of the graves revealed a deliberate cruelty, placed where the children would have to watch their parents' bodies disappear beneath the sand, but it was the children themselves that stopped him cold, freezing him in place like a deer that suddenly realizes it stands in a hunter's sights. They were so small. Even knowing what to expect from the tracks and signs, seeing them in person hit him like a physical blow. Their blonde hair caught the light like spun gold, so different from the black hair of his own people that they seemed like creatures from another world entirely. But their suffering was universal, written in the language of thirst and exhaustion and terror that every child learned too early in this harsh country. The older boy, Jacob, he would later learn, stirred slightly as Running Bear's shadow fell across him. His eyes opened, blue as deep water, and for a moment there was no recognition in them. Just the blank stare of someone whose mind had retreated far from what his body was enduring. Then awareness crept back in, and with it, fear. But Jacob didn't cry out, didn't try to shrink away from this new threat. Instead, he straightened his small shoulders and shifted slightly, placing himself between Running Bear and his younger brother. The gesture was heartbreaking in its futility. A 4-year-old boy trying to protect his twin with nothing but courage and love as weapons. Running Bear stopped moving. He crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. His hands remained visible, empty of weapons. In the Apache way, he spoke first with his posture, with the careful spacing of his movements, showing that he came in peace even before words could convey the same message. "Little warriors," he said softly. In English, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as one who had learned the language rather than being born to it. "I will not hurt you." Samuel's eyes fluttered open at the sound of a human voice speaking words he could understand. For 3 days, they had heard only the wind and the sound of their own labored breathing. The appearance of this scarred stranger felt like a dream or a hallucination, too unlikely to be real. Running Bear studied the children's bonds with the eye of a man who had been tied and beaten himself, who understood the mechanics of captivity from the victim's perspective. The rope was hemp, thick and rough, designed to hold struggling animals rather than delicate human wrists. It had been tied with military precision, someone in iron. Wolf's band had learned knots from cavalry prisoners. The children were badly dehydrated but still conscious, which meant there was time. Their skin showed the angry red of sunburn, but not yet the deeper damage that would mark them permanently. They had perhaps hours before the heat and thirst pushed them past the point where even rescue would come too late. But Running Bear didn't move to help them immediately. Instead, he sat back on his heels and studied them with the patience of a man who understood that hasty actions often created more problems than they solved. These children were not just victims of violence, they were symbols of the larger conflict. That was tearing the territory apart. Freeing them would mean taking sides in a war he had been trying to avoid. Iron Wolf's band had left them alive for a reason. They were meant to be found, meant to be rescued, or to die where other whites would discover them. Either outcome would serve the warrior's purpose. Rescued children would carry the story of Apache cruelty back to the settlements, while dead children would fuel the settlers' hunger for revenge. It was a calculated move in a larger game of chess played with human lives. If Running Bear cut them free and took them to safety, he would be choosing a side. The whites would see him as one of the good Indians, a helper to be rewarded with scraps and condescension. His own people would see him as a traitor, a man who valued white children's lives over Apache dignity. Either way, his careful neutrality would be shattered. But as he looked into Jacob's eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that held so much courage and so much pain, Running Bear felt the last of his neutrality crumble like sand between his fingers. There were some lines that couldn't be crossed, some cruelties that couldn't be ignored. Regardless of politics or strategy or survival, he had seen what happened when good men did nothing. He had watched his own people suffer while potential allies looked the other way, concerned only with their own safety. He had been that man himself more than once, choosing discretion over action, survival over righteousness. But every compromise had cost him something, until he sometimes felt like a ghost of the warrior he had once been. The children's eyes held no judgment, no expectation. They were beyond hope, existing in that numb space where pain becomes normal and rescue becomes unimaginable. They wouldn't blame him if he rode away. They probably expected it, which was exactly why he couldn't do it. Running Bear reached for his knife, the elkhorn handle warm in his palm. The children tensed, perhaps expecting this to be the end they had been waiting for. Instead, he cut a piece of leather fringe from his shirt and held it up where they could see it, then tied it in a simple knot. "This is what holds you," he said quietly, showing them the knot. Simple, easy to undo if you know how. He untied the leather and retied it, his movements slow and deliberate. Everything that seems impossible has a way through it. You just have to find the right place to push. Jacob blinked slowly, processing the words. Samuel watched with the intensity of a child who had learned that adults' actions often mattered more than their words. Running Bear stood and walked to Spotted Wind, returning with his water bag. He knelt beside Jacob first, tilting the bag carefully to let a small amount of water trickle between the boy's cracked lips. Jacob swallowed convulsively, his body remembering its need for survival. Then Running Bear did the same for Samuel, watching as a little color returned to the smaller boy's cheeks. "My name is Running Bear," he said as he capped the water bag. "In your language, some call me Charlie. I am going to take you away from this place." Jacob's voice was barely a whisper, rough as sand. Are you going to hurt us?" Running Bear met his eyes directly, the way he would meet the eyes of a fellow warrior. "No, little brother. I am going to teach you how to be strong." As he knelt to cut their bonds, Running Bear felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. He was no longer just a man trying to survive between two worlds. He was about to become something else entirely: protector, teacher, father to children who weren't his blood but would become his responsibility. The desert wind picked up, scattering sand across the broken wagon and the shallow graves. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like a battle cry or a blessing. Running Bear cut the first rope, and with it, severed the last threads that had kept him suspended between opposing forces. Whatever came next, there would be no more neutrality, no more careful balance. There would only be the choice he was making now: One cut of the knife at a time, the rope fell away from Jacob's wrists like shed skin, leaving behind raw, angry welts. That told the story of 3 days' struggle against hemp and hopelessness. The boy's hands, freed for the first time since the attack, trembled uncontrollably as blood began to flow back into fingers that had gone white with restricted circulation. He flexed them slowly, wincing at the pins and needles sensation, but his eyes never left Running Bear's face. Samuel's bonds came next, the knife slicing through the thick hemp with surgical precision. The younger twin was in worse condition. Smaller, more fragile, his body had begun shutting down more quickly than his brother's. When the rope fell away, he simply collapsed forward, lacking the strength to sit upright without support. Running Bear caught him gently, one scarred hand supporting the boy's back while the other cradled his head. "Easy, little warrior," Running Bear murmured, his voice carrying the rhythm of ancient lullabies his grandmother had sung to him. "Your body remembers how to be free. Give it time." But even as he spoke these comforting words, Running Bear's eyes were scanning the horizon with the constant vigilance of a man who had survived too many ambushes to ever truly relax. The war party's tracks were 4 days old, but in this country, 4 days was nothing. Warriors could cover ground like wolves when they needed to, and Iron Wolf was known for doubling back to check his work. More immediately dangerous were the buzzards. 3 of them now circled overhead, their patient spirals growing tighter as they sensed opportunity. Their presence would be visible for miles to anyone who knew how to read the desert signs. Every minute the children remained here increased the chances of unwanted attention from predators both animal and human. Running Bear lifted Samuel carefully, surprised by how light the boy felt, as if 3 days without food and water had begun to hollow out his small frame. He carried him to a patch of shade beside a large boulder, then returned for Jacob, who struggled to walk on legs that barely remembered how to support his weight. "My brother," Jacob whispered as Running Bear helped him to the shade. "Is Samuel going to die?" The question hit Running Bear like a physical blow. In Apache culture, children were treasures beyond measure, protected and cherished by the entire tribe. The idea of children abandoned to die alone went against everything his people held sacred. But he had learned that different peoples measured life differently, valued different things, made different choices about who deserved protection. "Your brother is strong," Running Bear said, settling Jacob beside Samuel in the shade. "Stronger than he looks, but he needs water, food, and time to heal. We will give him all 3. From his pack, Running Bear withdrew items that seemed almost magical in their simple effectiveness. A small clay pot, unglazed and porous, which he filled with water and placed in the shade where evaporation would keep the contents cool. Strips of jerky, tough as leather but rich with salt and protein. A handful of pinyon nuts, each one a small treasure of fat and flavor. And from a leather pouch worn smooth with age, a powder made from ground cactus root that his grandmother had taught him to prepare. He mixed the powder with water, creating a thin gruel that would be easier for the children to digest than solid food. The mixture smelled earthy and slightly bitter, but it would help their bodies retain moisture and begin the slow process of rebuilding strength. "This tastes like dirt," Jacob said after his first tentative sip, but he didn't refuse it. His brother managed only a few drops before his stomach rebelled, but Running Bear was patient, offering water in tiny amounts until Samuel's body remembered how to accept nourishment. As the children rested, Running Bear worked with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions quickly. He gathered what was salvageable from the Morrison family's scattered belongings, not because the items had value, but because they represented pieces of the children's former life that might comfort them later. The wooden horse with 3 legs went into his pack, along with the Bible and the daguerreotype that showed their family whole and happy. The broken wagon told a story he read like scripture. The attackers had been looking for something specific. Papers, documents, evidence of something more than simple westward migration. The way the family's belongings had been sorted and examined suggested intelligence gathering rather than random violence. Thomas Morrison hadn't just been a settler. He had been carrying information that Iron Wolf's band considered valuable. Running Bear found what they had been looking for in the false bottom of a trunk that had been pried open and hastily searched. Military maps marked with troop movements and supply routes. Correspondence between territorial officials discussing Apache treaty negotiations. Most damning of all, a letter of credit from a mining company authorizing the Morrison family to survey specific areas of Apache, sacred land for copper deposits. The pieces fell into place like stones settling into a riverbed. Thomas Morrison hadn't been an innocent settler seeking a new life. He had been a spy, a scout for interests that wanted to strip mine the heart of Apache territory. Iron Wolf's attack hadn't been random violence. It had been justice executed with the precision of a military operation. But the children were innocent of their father's sins, guilty of nothing more than being born into a world where adults made choices that echoed through generations. Running Bear folded the documents carefully and placed them in his pack. Evidence that might save lives later or prevent future conflicts, but evidence purchased with the blood of parents and the suffering of children. Samuel stirred in the shade, his eyes opening to focus on Running Bear's face. "Are you an Indian?" he asked with the directness of childhood, unaware that the question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. "I am Apache," Running Bear replied, settling cross-legged beside the boys. "My people have lived in this desert for more seasons than any man can count. We know its moods, its gifts, its dangers." Jacob struggled to sit up straighter. "Indians killed our mama and papa," he said, not with hatred but with the confused pain of someone trying to understand inexplicable loss. Running Bear nodded slowly. "Yes, some of my people did that thing. Just as some of your people have killed Apache children and their parents. The desert has drunk much blood from both our peoples. Why?" Samuel whispered, the word barely audible. It was a question that had haunted Running Bear for years, one that grew more complex with each passing season. How to explain to children the web of broken promises, stolen land, cultural misunderstanding, and simple human greed that had led to this moment. How to help them understand that their father had not been the innocent victim he appeared to be, without destroying their love for his memory. "Because," Running Bear said carefully, "sometimes people forget that we are all children of the same sky. They see only differences, the color of skin, the language of prayers, the shape of homes. They forget that Apache children and white children cry the same tears when they are afraid." He reached into his pack and withdrew the corn-husk doll that Samuel had clutched during his ordeal. The feathered headdress was torn now, the warrior figure battered by 3 days of exposure, but Running Bear examined it with the respect he would show a sacred object. "Your mother made this?" he asked. Samuel nodded, reaching for the doll with hands that still trembled. "She knew Apache ways," Running Bear observed, studying the careful stitching and traditional design. "This warrior is made in the old style, the way my grandmother would have sewn him. Your mother honored my people in her work. It was true." The doll showed a level of cultural understanding that surprised him. Sarah Morrison had not simply created a generic Indian figure, but had researched Apache clothing, weapons, and ceremonial dress. The feathers were attached correctly. The beadwork followed traditional patterns. The proportions reflected authentic warrior appearance. It suggested respect rather than stereotype, understanding rather than appropriation. "Mama said all warriors were brave," Jacob said quietly. "She said being brave meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Running Bear felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Here was common ground, a bridge between worlds built from a mother's wisdom and a child's innocence. Sarah Morrison might have married a man who made questionable choices, but she had tried to teach her children lessons that transcended the conflicts of their time. "Your mother was wise," he said. "That is the true meaning of a warrior's path. Not to seek violence, but to stand between danger and those who need protection." As if summoned by his words, Spotted Wind raised her head sharply, ears pricked forward in the universal horse signal for attention. Running Bear rose smoothly, his hand moving instinctively to his knife handle. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, dust clouds marked the approach of riders. "Stay in the shade," he told the children, his voice calm but commanding. "Do not move, do not speak, until I return." He walked to where Spotted Wind stood, stroking her neck to calm her while he studied the approaching dust. 3 riders, moving at a steady pace rather than the urgent speed of pursuit. Not iron Wolves. Band, they would approach more carefully, with scouts ahead and flankers wide. These riders moved like white men, direct and obvious, trusting in superior numbers and firepower rather than stealth. Running Bear made his decision with the same quick certainty that had kept him alive through a dozen conflicts. He would not run. Running would mean abandoning the children before they were strong enough to travel, and it would mark him as guilty of something in the riders' eyes. Instead, he would stand his ground and let them come to him. He checked his weapons, knife secure in its sheath, revolver loose in its holster, but not obviously ready for use. His stance was relaxed but balanced, projecting confidence without aggression. In his experience, how a man positioned himself often determined whether a confrontation ended in conversation or violence. The riders resolved into recognizable types. As they approached, a cavalry sergeant with sun-bleached stripes on his sleeves, a civilian dressed in the practical clothes of a territorial official, and a third man whose expensive hat and clean boots marked him as someone important enough to travel with an escort. They reined in 20 yards away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. "You there," the sergeant called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Apache. State your business here." Running Bear remained silent for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. In Apache culture, silence was power, the ability to wait, to think, to choose the moment for speech rather than be compelled to respond immediately. The white men shifted in their saddles, their horses pawing the ground with impatience that reflected their riders' mood. "I found children," Running Bear said finally, his English deliberately simple and measured. "White children, they need help." The civilian leaned forward in his saddle, interest sharpening his features. "Children? What children? Where?" Instead of answering immediately, Running Bear walked slowly toward the boulder where Jacob and Samuel rested in the shade. The riders followed, their horses' hooves crunching on the rocky ground. When they rounded the boulder and saw the boys, the sergeant let out a low whistle of surprise. "Jesus Christ," the civilian breathed. "Morrison's boys. We've been looking for them for 3 days." The expensive hack dismounted quickly, his movements betraying an urgency that contradicted his earlier air of casual authority. He knelt beside the children, his face a mixture of relief and calculation that Running Bear found disturbing. "Jacob." "Samuel," the man said, his voice taking on the false warmth adults often used with children. "I'm Mr. Patterson from the territorial office. We're here to take you somewhere safe." But Jacob shrank back from the man's reaching hands, pressing closer to Samuel with protective instincts that had been honed by 3 days of abandonment and terror. His eyes found Running Bear's face, seeking reassurance from the only adult who had shown him genuine kindness. "The Apache stays with us," Jacob said with surprising firmness for a 4-year-old. "He saved us." Patterson's expression shifted, calculation replacing false warmth. His eyes moved from the children to Running Bear to the broken wagon beyond. clearly reassessing the situation and finding complications he hadn't expected. "Son," Patterson said carefully, "this Indian might have found you, but we need to get you to people who can properly care for you. White people, Christian people." "He gave us water," Samuel said weakly but clearly. "He said we were warriors." The sergeant moved his horse closer, his hand resting casually on his saber hilt. "Apache," he said, "you've done a good thing here. But these boys need to come with us now, you understand?" Running Bear understood perfectly. He understood that these men saw him as a convenient savage who had stumbled across lost children and could now be dismissed with perfunctory thanks. He understood that they had no intention of honoring his role in the rescue or considering the children's wishes. He understood that in their eyes, his brown skin made him unsuitable as a protector, regardless of his actions. But he also understood something else, something the white men couldn't see because they had never learned to read. The subtle signs that spoke louder than words. Jacob's small hand had crept toward his own, seeking contact with the only person who had treated him with dignity in the worst moments of his young life. Samuel's eyes never left his face, even when the adults spoke directly to him. The children had made their choice. Now Running Bear had to make his. He stepped between Patterson and the boys, not aggressively, but with the quiet certainty of a man who would not be moved. "The little warriors stay with me," he said simply, "until they are strong enough to choose for themselves." The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around the 6 figures beside the boulder. In the distance, the buzzards still circled, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The standoff stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight, each man calculating odds and consequences while the desert sun climbed toward its merciless peak. Patterson's face had hardened into the expression of a bureaucrat confronting unexpected resistance, his earlier false warmth evaporating like morning dew. The sergeant's hand remained poised near his weapon, professional instincts warring with the awkwardness of threatening a man who had just rescued white children. But it was the third man, the one with the expensive hat who had remained mounted, who broke the silence with a voice like gravel grinding in a mill. "Charlie Crowfeather," he said, the name carrying recognition and something darker. "Should have known we'd find you in the middle of this mess." Running Bear's eyes sharpened, focusing on the speaker with new attention. The expensive clothes and clean boots now made sense, as did the man's confident authority over both civilian and military personnel. This was no territorial bureaucrat, but someone with real power, someone who knew Apache names and histories. "Colonel Benjamin Hayes," Running Bear replied, his voice neutral but watchful. "Still buying information with other men's blood, I see." Hayes dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He was older than Running Bear remembered, grayer, softer around the middle, with the pallor of a man who spent more time behind desks than in the field. But his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him both valuable and dangerous during the treaty negotiations 3 years past. Those are harsh words from a man who spent the last 2 years running errands for whoever pays. "Best," Hayes said, stepping closer with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others through reputation alone. "What's your price for the Morrison boys?" "Same rate you charged for guiding those surveyor teams through Apache sacred ground?" The accusation hit like a physical blow, and Running Bear felt Jacob's small hand slip into his own, offering comfort. With the instinctive generosity of childhood. The boy couldn't understand the words being spoken, but he recognized the tone of attack and responded with protective loyalty that both humbled and strengthened the Apache warrior. "Those surveys were legal," Running Bear said quietly, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Authorized by treaties your government signed." "Treaties your people violated within 6 months," Patterson interjected, his bureaucratic instincts sensing an opportunity to press an advantage. "Treaties that gave us clear rights to mineral exploration in designated areas." Samuel stirred weakly in the shade, his fevered eyes moving between the adults as their voices grew harder, more threatening. His small fingers clutched the battered cornhusk doll, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper but carried clearly in the desert stillness. "Don't fight," he pleaded. "Please don't fight anymore." The simple words from a child who had seen too much violence carried more weight than all the legal arguments and historical grievances. Hayes paused mid-sentence, his eyes moving to the small boy whose parents his policies had likely doomed. For a moment, something almost like shame flickered across his weathered features. Running Bear knelt beside Samuel, one hand checking the boy's forehead for fever while keeping his attention divided between the child and the armed men. Samuel's skin was hot and dry despite the water and care, his body still struggling to recover from 3 days of exposure and trauma. "He needs rest," Running Bear said, rising slowly but remaining close to the children. "Real rest and shade, with clean water and proper food. Not a hard ride to some fort where he'll be another problem for overworked soldiers to handle." "Fort Collins has a surgeon," the sergeant offered, his tone less aggressive now that the focus had shifted to the children's immediate needs. "Medical supplies, proper beds." "Fort Collins has typhoid," Running Bear replied flatly. 3 cases. Last week, according to the traders. "You want to take sick children into a disease camp." Hayes cursed under his breath, recognizing the truth in the Apache's words. Military posts were notorious for their poor sanitation and tendency to become disease-breeding grounds, especially during summer months when water grew scarce and hygiene became a luxury. "Then what do you propose?" Hayes asked, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Keep them out here in the desert until they die of exposure." Instead of answering directly, Running Bear turned to Jacob, whose blue eyes watched the adults with the wary intelligence of someone forced to grow up too quickly. The boy had been listening to everything, processing information with survival instincts honed by recent trauma. "Little warrior," Running Bear said gently, "these men want to take you to a place with other white people. They say it will be safer for you there. What do you think?" Jacob's response was immediate and decisive. "I want to stay with you. Samuel wants to stay too." He looked at his brother, seeking confirmation, and Samuel managed a weak nod despite his fever. "Son," Patterson began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone adults used when dismissing children's preferences. "You don't understand what you're saying. This Apache ... this man. He's not your people. You belong with your own kind." "He saved us," Jacob said with the simple logic of childhood cutting through adult complications. "He gave us water when we were dying. He didn't leave us tied to the wagon like the others did." The accusation hung in the desert air like smoke from a signal fire. Hayes and Patterson exchanged glances that spoke of guilt and political calculation in equal measure. They had known about the Morrison family's mission, had perhaps even authorized it, but they had also known the risks. When the attack came, their concern had been for the information Thomas Morrison carried, not for his children's lives. Running Bear saw the truth in their faces and felt the last of his neutrality crumble completely. These men represented everything he had grown to despise about the territorial government, the willingness to sacrifice innocent lives for political gain, the casual assumption that white interests trumped all other considerations, the breathtaking arrogance that saw Apache land as something to be parceled out to mining companies without consultation or compensation. "The children have spoken," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had made his final choice. "In Apache law, children old enough to speak for themselves have the right to choose their protectors. I will honor their choice." Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Apache law doesn't mean shit out here, Charlie. This is United States territory, governed by United States law. Those boys are white orphans, and they'll be placed with white families according to proper legal procedures." "Legal procedures," Running Bear repeated, his tone carefully neutral. Like the legal procedures that sent their father to survey sacred Apache burial grounds for copper deposits. Like the legal procedures that authorized military escorts for mining company representatives. The questions hit their target. Hayes's face flushed red above his collar, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before military discipline reasserted itself. Patterson looked confused, clearly unaware of the full scope of the Morrison mission and uncomfortable with the implications being revealed, but it was the sergeant who provided the most telling reaction. His weathered face showed recognition and disgust in equal measure, the expression of a professional soldier who had been asked to enforce policies he found morally questionable. His hand moved away from his weapon entirely, settling instead on his horse's reins, as if preparing to leave. "Colonel," the sergeant said carefully, "maybe we should consider what's best for the boys' immediate health. They've been through hell, and that little one looks like he's burning up with fever. Moving them right now might do more harm than—" "Good." Hayes turned on his subordinate with barely controlled fury. "Sergeant Miller, your job is to follow orders, not provide medical opinions." But Miller had spent 20 years in the frontier army, long enough to recognize when orders conflicted with basic human decency. "Sir, my orders were to locate and rescue the Morrison children. Seems to me they've already been rescued. Question. Now is whether we help them recover or risk killing them with good intentions." The split in the white men's ranks was exactly what Running Bear had been hoping for. Military men, especially veteran sergeants, often had more practical wisdom than their officers, and Sergeant Miller clearly understood that sometimes the right thing to do conflicted with regulations and politics. Samuel chose that moment to prove the sergeant's point by attempting to sit up and promptly vomiting what little water he had managed to keep down. The sight of the small boy retching weakly while his brother tried to comfort him seemed to settle the immediate argument. More effectively than any words, Running Bear moved quickly, supporting Samuel while cleaning him up with gentle efficiency. From his pack, he withdrew a different powder, one made from willow bark and other plants that would help reduce fever and settle his stomach. He mixed it with small amounts of water, encouraging Samuel to take tiny sips while singing softly. In Apache, the ancient healing songs his grandmother had taught him, Jacob watched this care with eyes that held understanding beyond his years. When Running Bear finished tending to Samuel, the older boy spoke with quiet determination. "He knows how to help," Jacob said, looking directly at Hayes. "You don't. You just want to take us away because we're white and he's Apache. But he's the one who saved us. He's the one who stayed." The word "stayed" carried particular weight in the desert silence that followed. It reminded everyone present that while these officials had been conducting their bureaucratic search, an Apache warrior had been providing actual aid to dying children. It highlighted the difference between political responsibility and personal commitment, between duty performed for appearance and compassion offered without expectation of reward. Hayes stared at the small boy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier arrogance. "What exactly are you proposing, Charlie? That we just leave white children in the custody of an Apache warrior? That we pretend there won't be consequences when word of this gets out?" "I'm proposing," Running Bear said carefully, "that we do what's best for these children instead of what's most politically convenient. Let them recover their strength. Give them time to process what happened to their parents. Then, when they're healthy and thinking clearly, let them choose their own path. And if they still choose to stay with you—" Running Bear met Hayes's gaze directly. "Then I will teach them to survive in both worlds, Apache and white. They will learn the skills they need to live in either, to honor both their birth parents and their chosen protector." Patterson sputtered protests about legal procedures and proper guardianship, but his words seemed hollow in the face of Samuel's labored breathing and Jacob's fierce protectiveness of his Apache rescuer. Even he could see that immediate bureaucratic solutions might prove fatal to the very children they were supposedly trying to protect. Sergeant Miller dismounted and approached the makeshift camp, his movements slow and non-threatening. He knelt beside Samuel, studying the boy's flushed face and rapid breathing with the eye of a man who had seen many kinds of sickness in frontier conditions. "How long before you can get him well enough to travel?" he asked Running Bear directly, ignoring the chain of command that should have required him to address his colonel first. 3 days, maybe 4, Running Bear replied. "If the fever breaks, and he can keep food down, longer if complications develop." Miller nodded, rising to face Hayes with the respectful but determined expression of a subordinate about to challenge orders. "Sir, I recommend we establish a temporary camp here and monitor the situation. Moving the children now could kill them. Moving them in a few days when they're stronger makes tactical and humanitarian sense." It was a compromise that offered Hayes a way to maintain authority while acknowledging practical realities. More importantly, it gave the children time to heal and make decisions without the pressure of immediate displacement. Hayes considered for a long moment, his political instincts warring with the evidence of his own eyes. Finally, he nodded curtly. 3 days, Sergeant. Establish a perimeter camp, watch everything and everyone, and Charlie ... He fixed Running Bear with a stare that held both warning and grudging respect. "Those boys better be alive and healthy. When this is over, if anything happens to them under your care, you'll answer for it." Running Bear inclined his head slightly, accepting both the challenge and the responsibility. "They will be stronger than they are now," he promised. "In body and in spirit." As the white men moved off to establish their camp, Jacob tugged at Running Bear's shirt, seeking attention. When the Apache warrior knelt beside him, the boy whispered a question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Are you going to leave us too?" Running Bear looked into those trusting blue eyes and felt something fundamental shift in his chest, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration that would reshape the landscape of his life forever. "No, little warrior," he said softly, "I will never leave you. That is a promise sealed with blood and witnessed by the sky itself." Samuel stirred at his brother's voice, his fevered eyes focusing briefly on Running Bear's scarred face. "Promise?" he whispered. "Promise," Running Bear repeated, and as he spoke the word, he felt the weight of it settle into his bones, like truth made manifest. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the possibility of change, the first. Night tested everything Running Bear knew about healing and everything the children knew about trust. Samuel's fever spiked after sunset, his small body shaking with chills despite the desert's retained heat. Jacob refused to sleep, sitting vigil beside his brother with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had already lost too much to allow. Death another victory. Running Bear worked through the darkness with the methodical precision of a medicine man, though he had never claimed that sacred title. His grandmother, White Dove Woman, had taught him the healing ways before the soldiers came to their mountain village. She had shown him which plants drew poison from wounds, which roots calmed fevered minds, which songs carried prayers to the spirits who governed life and death. "The sickness fights to stay," he explained to Jacob as he prepared a new poultice. "From prickly pear cactus and sage. Your brother's body must decide whether to surrender or resist. We can help, but the choice belongs to him." Jacob watched every movement, memorizing the careful way Running Bear ground the plants, the precise amount of water he added, the gentle manner in which he applied the cooling mixture to Samuel's burning forehead. There was something almost sacred in the Apache warrior's movements, a reverence for the healing process that spoke of deeper spiritual understanding. "Will you teach me?" Jacob asked suddenly, his voice small but determined in the darkness. "Will you teach me to help him?" Running Bear paused in his work, studying the boy's face in the flickering light of their small fire. In Apache culture, the desire to heal was considered a calling from the spirits themselves, not something to be taught lightly to outsiders. But looking into Jacob's earnest blue eyes, he saw something that transcended blood and culture, the pure intention to serve others, the willingness to learn whatever was necessary to protect those he loved. "First," Running Bear said, handing Jacob a small gourd filled with cool water, "you must learn to listen. Your brother's body will tell you what it needs, but only if you listen with more than your ears." He guided Jacob's small hands to Samuel's wrist, showing him how to feel for the rapid flutter of pulse that spoke of a body working too hard to survive. Then to his forehead, teaching him to recognize the difference between healing fever that burned clean and dangerous fever that consumed without purpose. "What do you hear?" Running Bear asked softly. Jacob closed his eyes, concentrating with the absolute focus that children brought to things they deemed truly important. "His heart is scared," he said finally. "It's beating like a rabbit when the hawks come." The observation was more accurate than many trained medicine men might have managed. Running Bear nodded approvingly. "Fear makes the body fight against itself. We must give his heart permission to slow down, to trust that safety has come." From his medicine bundle, Running Bear withdrew a small drum made from deer hide, stretched over a wooden frame. The instrument had belonged to his grandfather, a war chief who had learned that healing required as much courage as fighting. The drumhead was painted with symbols that told the story of the eagle's flight from earth to sky, a journey every soul must make, but not necessarily today. "In Apache way," Running Bear explained as he began a slow, rhythmic beat, "we drum the heartbeat of the earth. When our hearts match Earth's rhythm, fear cannot live in the same space as peace." The drumbeat was hypnotic, steady as a mother's heartbeat heard from the womb. Jacob found his own breathing slowing to match the rhythm, and gradually Samuel's labored breathing began to ease as well. The fever didn't break immediately, but something in the small boy's posture relaxed, as if he had been given permission to stop fighting so hard against his own recovery. As the night wore on, Running Bear shared stories that his grandmother had told him during his own childhood illnesses. Tales of Coyote the trickster, who taught that sometimes the greatest wisdom came from making mistakes. Stories of Eagle, who showed that true strength meant knowing when to soar and when to rest. Legends of the sacred mountains, where the spirits gathered to watch over all children, regardless of the color of their skin or the language of their prayers. Jacob listened with the rapt attention of someone starved for stories that offered hope instead of harsh realities. These tales were nothing like the Bible stories his mother had read to him, with their emphasis on sin and judgment and the constant need to prove worthiness. Apache stories seemed to assume that children were already worthy of love and protection, that their job was simply to grow into the wisdom the world offered them. "Why do your stories never have bad endings?" Jacob asked as dawn began to lighten. The eastern sky, Running Bear considered the question seriously. "Apache stories are medicine stories. They are meant to heal the spirit, not frighten it. Bad things happen in life, you know this already. Stories should give strength to face those bad things, not add more fear to what fear already exists." As the sun rose, Samuel's fever finally broke. His breathing deepened into natural sleep rather than the restless unconsciousness of sickness, and his skin began to cool to normal temperature. Jacob fell asleep beside his brother, one small hand still resting on Samuel's wrist. Monitoring his pulse even in sleep, Running Bear allowed himself a moment of profound relief before beginning the day's more practical tasks. The children were past the crisis point, but full recovery would require careful nutrition and gradual activity. More challenging would be the ongoing negotiation with Colonel Hayes and his men, who had established their camp 100 yards away and watched every movement with suspicious eyes. Sergeant Miller approached mid-morning, his weathered face showing grudging respect for the medical skills he had witnessed during the night. That was quite a performance, he said, though his tone suggested admiration rather than mockery. Not performance, Running Bear replied quietly, checking the children's water supply. Medicine way. Your people have doctors. Apache people have. Different knowledge, but knowledge still. Miller nodded slowly. My grandmother was part Cherokee. She used to say white doctors treated symptoms, but Indian medicine treated the whole person. Never understood what she meant until I watched you work last night. The admission created an unexpected bridge between the two men. Miller had served on the frontier long enough to see the failures of military medicine, the way treating wounded. Soldiers, like broken machinery, often led to healed bodies, but broken spirits. What he had witnessed during Samuel's crisis was something different, a holistic approach that addressed fear and despair along with physical symptoms. The boys seem to trust you completely, Miller observed, watching Jacob help his brother sip water with the careful attention of a trained assistant. Trust is not given, Running Bear said. Trust is earned through consistent action over time. These children have learned to recognize who stays and who leaves when staying becomes difficult. The implied criticism wasn't lost on Miller, who had seen too many abandoned settlements and broken promises to argue with the assessment. Military policy often required strategic withdrawals that left civilian populations to fend for themselves. The Morrison children's situation was just another example of what happened when political objectives took precedence over human welfare. By midday, Samuel was strong enough to sit up without assistance and take solid food, small pieces of jerky softened in warm water, along with pine nut mush that provided essential fats and proteins. Jacob had appointed himself chief nurse, carefully measuring out portions and monitoring his brother's reactions with scientific precision. He learns quickly, Running Bear observed as Jacob demonstrated the proper way to test fever by feeling both forehead and wrist. Mama taught us to pay attention to important things, Jacob replied matter-of-factly. She said you never know when you might need to take care of someone yourself. The comment revealed layers of preparation that Sarah Morrison had provided. For her children, practical skills disguised as games, survival knowledge presented as interesting facts. She had been preparing them for frontier life in ways that went beyond the superficial skills most settler children learned. Colonel Hayes arrived in mid-afternoon, his expression a mixture of professional assessment and personal curiosity. He studied the recovered children with the eye of a man trying to reconcile political necessities with observable realities. Samuel was clearly on the mend, sitting up and speaking in complete sentences. Jacob had taken on responsibilities that showed remarkable maturity for a 4-year-old. Impressive recovery, Hayes admitted grudgingly. Your methods seem to have been effective. Apache methods, Running Bear corrected. Learned from grandmothers who kept children alive through winters that killed grown warriors. Nothing mysterious, just different knowledge applied with patience. Hayes walked slowly around the camp, noting the careful organization, the way supplies were rationed and conserved, the obvious affection between the Apache warrior and the white children. His trained eye could find no fault with the care being provided, which complicated his political problem considerably. The territorial authorities will expect a full report, he said finally. They'll want to know why I left white orphans in the custody of an Apache instead of bringing them immediately to proper facilities. And what will you tell them? Running Bear asked. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching Jacob demonstrate to Samuel how to identify edible desert plants by their leaves and growth patterns. The sight of a 4-year-old white boy eagerly learning Apache survival skills would have been shocking to most territorial officials. But Hayes had spent enough time on the frontier to recognize practical education when he saw it. I'll tell them the truth, he said finally. That the children were dying when we found them, that they've made a remarkable recovery under your care, and that removing them prematurely would have been medically irresponsible. It wasn't the political answer Running Bear had expected, and his surprise must have shown on his face. "Don't mistake pragmatism for sentiment," Hayes warned. "But I've seen enough dead children on this frontier to recognize when someone's methods work. The question now is what happens next. These boys can't live in the desert forever, and you can't protect them from every political storm that's coming." The colonel's words carried the weight of prophecy. Already, rumors would be spreading through the settlements about the Apache warrior who had taken white children under his protection. Some would see it as a hopeful sign of cross-cultural cooperation. Others would view it as evidence of dangerous Apache influence over innocent minds. "What do you suggest?" Running Bear asked, recognizing that Hayes might be the closest thing to an ally he was likely to find among territorial officials. Hayes studied the children again, watching as Samuel showed Jacob how to braid grass in the pattern their mother had taught him, while Jacob shared the Apache method for starting fires with wet kindling. The cultural exchange was happening naturally, without self-consciousness or conflict. "There's a mission school in Santa Fe," Hayes said slowly, "run by a priest named Father Miguel Santos. He's different from most. Believes education should build bridges instead of walls. If anyone could handle a situation like this, it would be him." Running Bear felt something cold settle in his stomach. Mission schools were infamous among his people for their systematic destruction of Apache culture, their insistence on replacing native identity with white Christian conformity. Children who entered mission schools often emerged as strangers to their own families. "I have heard of such schools," he said carefully. "They take Apache children and return them as white people with brown skin." "This one's different," Hayes insisted. "Santos teaches both Spanish and English, but he doesn't forbid native languages. His students learn European history, but they also study their own tribal traditions. He believes strength comes from understanding multiple worlds, not from forgetting where you came from." It was an interesting proposition, but Running Bear remained skeptical. He had heard similar promises before, usually from well-meaning officials who had little understanding of how institutional pressures corrupted individual good intentions. And the children would have choice? He asked. They could leave if they wished. Hayes hesitated, revealing the limitations of his proposal. They would have more choice than most places. Santos respects individual conscience more than most priests. But they would still be bound by territorial laws regarding orphaned children. As if summoned by their conversation, Jacob approached with Samuel leaning heavily on his arm. Both boys had been listening with the sharp attention of children whose futures were being decided by adult conversations. "Are you going to make us leave?" Jacob asked directly, his blue eyes moving between Hayes and Running Bear, with the calculating intelligence of someone who had learned to read adult intentions for signs of abandonment. Hayes knelt to bring himself to the boy's eye level, a gesture that showed more respect than most adults offered children. "No one's going to make you do anything right now," he said. "But eventually, you'll need to decide what kind of life you want to build. Charlie here can teach you important things, but there are other things you'll need to learn too." Samuel stepped forward, still weak but determined to speak for himself. "We want to stay with Running Bear," he said, using the Apache name with careful pronunciation. "He saved us. He taught us medicine. He tells us stories that don't scare us." The simple declaration carried more weight than legal arguments or bureaucratic procedures. These children had made their choice based on the most fundamental criterion possible. Who had proven trustworthy when trust meant the difference between life and death. Hayes stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. What if there was a way to honor both worlds? To learn what you need to know to survive as white children, while also keeping the Apache wisdom Charlie's been sharing. Running Bear felt a spark of possibility, quickly tempered by hard experience. Such a place would face opposition from both our peoples. Whites who fear Apache influence, Apache who distrust white education. "Maybe," Hayes agreed. But these boys represent something new, a bridge between worlds that doesn't require either side to surrender everything they value. That might be worth the opposition. As the afternoon wore on, the outlines of an unprecedented arrangement began to take shape. Not a perfect solution, but perhaps a workable one that honored the children's choices while acknowledging the political realities they would have to navigate. The rescue had become something larger than anyone had anticipated, not just the saving of 2 lives, but the creation of a new possibility for how different peoples might coexist without destroying what made each of them unique. As evening approached, Running Bear began teaching both boys the Apache evening prayer, a song of gratitude for the day's blessings and hope for tomorrow's opportunities. Their young voices blended with his deeper tones, creating a harmony that carried across the desert like a promise of better things to come. On the second morning, when Samuel's strength had returned enough for him to walk without support and Jacob had memorized the basic healing songs, Running Bear made a decision that would change everything. He announced they were moving to a place he called the Sacred Shelter, a hidden canyon 3 miles north, where his people had once gathered for vision quests and healing ceremonies. Colonel Hayes objected immediately. "Our agreement was for you to stay put while the boys recovered. Moving them to some remote location defeats the purpose of our supervision." But Running Bear had spent the night considering their situation with the strategic mind of a warrior who had survived countless conflicts. The desert camp was too exposed, too visible to anyone who might be tracking them. More importantly, the constant presence of armed soldiers was hampering the deep healing work the children needed. "The boys' bodies are mending," he explained to Hayes as they walked apart from the others. "But their spirits carry wounds that require different medicine. They need a place where they can speak freely about their parents' death, where they can learn to trust the world again without soldiers watching their every breath." Hayes studied Running Bear's scarred face, recognizing something in the Apache's eyes that went beyond simple concern for the children's physical welfare. "You're talking about some kind of Indian ceremony, aren't you? Some spiritual mumbo-jumbo. That's going to fill their heads with savage nonsense. I'm talking about helping 2 small boys understand that they are not cursed, that their parents' death was not punishment for some imagined wrongdoing, that they have value beyond their usefulness to territorial politics," Running Bear replied with quiet intensity. "Your people have such places too. Churches, counselors, ways of healing minds and hearts that medicine cannot touch." The comparison was apt enough to give Hayes pause. He had seen soldiers broken by combat trauma, men whose bodies healed perfectly, but whose minds remained trapped in endless cycles of guilt and terror. The military had few effective treatments for such wounds, often dismissing them as weakness or cowardice, rather than recognizing them as legitimate injuries requiring specialized care. Sergeant Miller, who had been listening from a respectful distance, stepped forward with the confident manner of a man about to share hard-won wisdom. "Colonel, if I may speak plainly, I've seen what happens to children who witness the kind of violence these boys experienced. Most of them never recover fully. They grow up carrying ghosts, jumping at shadows, never able to trust anyone completely." He paused, studying Jacob and Samuel as they practiced identifying medicinal plants under Running Bear's patient guidance. "But I've also seen a few who got proper help early enough. They're different, still marked by what they went through, but not broken by it. If this Apache knows how to provide that kind of healing, maybe we should let him try." Hayes weighed the political risks against the human needs, a calculation that had become increasingly difficult as he watched the boys' obvious attachment to their rescuer grow stronger each day. Removing them forcibly would likely traumatize them further, while allowing them to disappear into some hidden canyon would invite criticism from his superiors. 2 days, he said finally. 2 days in your sacred place, with my sergeant accompanying you to observe and report. After that, we discuss permanent arrangements." Running Bear nodded acceptance of the compromise, though privately he doubted. 2 days would be sufficient for the deep work the children needed. Still, it was better than nothing, and it would give him time to show Hayes's representative what Apache healing methods could accomplish. The sacred shelter revealed itself gradually. As they climbed through increasingly narrow passages between red stone walls that seemed to pulse with ancient power, the canyon opened suddenly into a circular amphitheater perhaps 50 yards across, with walls that rose straight up for over 100 feet before breaking into the desert sky above. At the center of the space, a natural spring bubbled up from underground sources, creating a small pool surrounded by green grass and wildflowers that seemed impossible in the harsh desert environment. Ancient petroglyphs covered the lower sections of the canyon walls, spirals and human figures and animal shapes that told stories in a language older than memory. "My God," Sergeant Miller breathed, removing his hat automatically in response to the obvious sanctity of the place. "How long have your people been coming here?" "Since the beginning of Apache time," Running Bear replied, helping Samuel down from Spotted Wind's back, while Jacob slid down on his own with increasing confidence. "When the world was young and the spirits walked openly among the people. This place was old when my grandfather's grandfather was born." Even Hayes, arriving an hour later with pack animals carrying supplies, seemed subdued by the canyon's atmosphere. The walls created perfect acoustics, so that the slightest whisper carried clearly while outside sounds remained completely blocked. It was like entering a natural cathedral designed by forces that understood the human need for sacred space. Running Bear established their camp with the ritualistic care of someone performing a ceremony. Each placement of stones, each arrangement of supplies, followed patterns that spoke of deep cultural knowledge. He explained to the boys that in Apache tradition, every action in a sacred place carried meaning and consequence. "We are guests here," he told them as they helped gather wood for the evening fire. "The spirits of this place are our hosts. We must show proper respect through our behavior, our thoughts, and our intentions." Jacob, who had grown up with strict religious instruction, understood the concept immediately. But Samuel, younger and more literal-minded, asked the questions that cut to the heart of spiritual matters. "Are the spirits scary?" He wanted to know, his blue eyes wide as he studied the petroglyphs that seemed to shift and dance in the changing light. "Some spirits are scary," Running Bear admitted, settling cross-legged beside the boys as twilight filled the canyon with purple shadows. "But not these spirits. These are healing spirits, teaching spirits, protecting spirits. They gather here because this place makes them happy." He pointed to a section of rock art that showed human figures with their arms raised toward the sky, surrounded by animals and plants and geometric patterns that suggested harmony and abundance. These pictures were made by Apache artists many generations ago. They show people celebrating, learning, growing strong. That is what happens in this place. As full darkness fell, Running Bear began the deep healing work that was the real purpose of their journey. He started with stories, not the entertaining tales he had shared during Samuel's fever, but sacred narratives that addressed the specific traumas the boys had experienced. The story of the Orphaned twins was an ancient Apache legend about two brothers whose parents were killed by enemies during a great war. Left alone in the wilderness, the twins were adopted by the animal spirits who taught them the skills they needed, not just to survive, but to become great leaders of their people. The twins learned that losing their birth parents was not the end of their story. Running Bear explained as the fire cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls. It was the beginning of a different story, one where they gained wisdom and power from overcoming great hardship. Jacob listened with the intensity of someone recognizing his own experience reflected in ancient wisdom. Did the twins ever stop missing their real parents? He asked. "They never stopped loving their parents," Running Bear replied carefully. "Love for people who die does not die with them. But they learned that love could grow to include new people without betraying the memory of the old ones. The lesson was subtle but essential, that accepting care from Running Bear did not constitute disloyalty to Thomas and Sarah Morrison's memory. The boys needed permission to form new attachments without guilt, to embrace the future without feeling they were abandoning the past. Over the following days, Running Bear guided them through adapted versions of traditional Apache healing ceremonies. They made prayer bundles from sage and sweetgrass, physical objects that could hold their fears and sorrows. They learned to use the canyon's echo effects to literally give voice to emotions they had been holding inside. Anger is medicine too. Running Bear taught them when Jacob finally exploded into rage about his parents' death, his small fists pounding the earth as he screamed his fury at the unfairness of it all. Anger that comes from love is clean anger. Let it burn bright, then let it burn out. Samuel's healing took a different form. The younger boy had internalized his trauma more deeply, blaming himself for not being able to protect his parents, despite his obvious helplessness in the situation. Running Bear used traditional sand painting techniques to help Samuel externalize these feelings. Together, they created elaborate patterns in the soft sand beside the spring, geometric designs that represented the boy's internal emotional landscape. As Samuel worked, guided by Running Bear's gentle questions and observations, he began to identify and name feelings he hadn't been able to express in words. "I was too little," Samuel whispered as he carefully placed colored stones to represent his family members. "I should have been bigger, stronger. I should have fought the bad men." "Show me," Running Bear said quietly, "what fighting would have looked like for someone your size." Samuel picked up a small stick and waved it ineffectively at the air, and the obvious futility of his imagined resistance finally broke through his self-blame. He began to cry, not the frightened tears of trauma, but the cleansing tears of grief, honestly expressed and accepted. Sergeant Miller watched these healing sessions with fascination and growing respect. As a career soldier, he had seen numerous approaches to dealing with combat trauma, but nothing that matched the sophisticated psychological techniques he was witnessing. The Apache method seemed to address the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, in ways that military medicine rarely attempted. On the final evening, Running Bear performed a ceremony he had never shared with white people before, the adoption ritual that formally welcomed outsiders into Apache family structures. It was a sacred procedure that carried lifelong obligations and could not be undertaken lightly. In Apache law, he explained to Colonel Hayes, who had returned for the ceremony, adoption creates bonds as strong as blood. These boys would become my sons in every way that matters. I would be responsible for their education, their welfare, their preparation for adult life. Hayes studied the boys' faces as Running Bear spoke. Jacob and Samuel showed no fear or reluctance, only eager anticipation. They had made their choice weeks ago. This ceremony would simply formalize what their hearts had already accepted. "And if territorial law requires them to receive white education?" Hayes asked. "Then I will ensure they receive the best white education available," Running Bear replied. "But they will also receive Apache education. They will be men of two worlds, able to walk in both with honor." The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Running Bear painted traditional symbols on the boys' foreheads, using pigments made from sacred clay and plant dyes. He spoke prayers in Apache, asking the spirits to witness and bless the adoption. Finally, he gave each boy a new name that would exist alongside their birth names. Jacob became Stands Between Worlds for his role as protector and bridge builder. Samuel received the name Quiet Thunder for the inner strength that had sustained him through crisis. These names carried power and responsibility, marking them as Apache warriors in training while honoring their white heritage. As the ceremony concluded, Colonel Hayes found himself moved despite his initial skepticism. What he had witnessed was Not the savage ritual he had expected, but a sophisticated legal and spiritual process that created genuine family bonds while respecting individual identity. "This changes everything," he admitted to Running Bear as they talked privately after the boys had fallen asleep. "If word gets out that I sanctioned an Apache adoption ceremony for white orphans, there'll be political hell to pay." "Then perhaps," Running Bear suggested quietly, "the time has come to change what politics considers acceptable." The canyon walls seemed to echo with possibilities as the two men contemplated a future where cultural boundaries might become bridges instead of barriers, where children like Jacob and Samuel could grow up belonging to multiple worlds without being forced to choose between them. In the morning, they would return to the harsh realities of territorial politics and racial tensions. But tonight, in this sacred place, a new kind of family had been born, one that might just be strong enough to survive the storms ahead. The confrontation came 6 weeks later, not in the desert where Running Bear held advantage, but in the territorial courthouse in Tucson, where white law reigned supreme and Apache voices carried no legal weight. Word of the adoption had spread through the settlements like wildfire, growing more distorted with each telling until the simple story of rescue and healing had become a tale of savage brainwashing and cultural corruption. Running Bear stood in the defendant's dock wearing his finest clothes, a combination of traditional Apache regalia and frontier formal wear that spoke to his bicultural identity. The eagle feathers in his hair caught the courtroom's lamplight, while his clean white shirt and pressed trousers showed respect for the legal proceedings. Even if he disputed their authority over Apache family matters, Jacob and Samuel sat in the front row, flanked by Sergeant Miller and Father Miguel Santos, the mission priest who had agreed to represent their interests. The boys wore simple frontier clothing, but each bore the small medicine bundle Running Bear had given them during the adoption ceremony. Their presence in the courtroom was itself controversial. Most child custody cases proceeded without consulting the children involved. The prosecuting attorney was Clarence Whitman, a political appointee from back east who had built his territorial career on promises to civilize the Apache population through aggressive legal intervention. He paced before the jury like a stage actor, his voice carrying the melodramatic flourishes of someone more concerned with performance than justice. "Gentlemen of the jury," Whitman began, his tone suggesting grave danger lurked behind every word. "We are here today to address a threat to the very foundations of Christian civilization in this territory. 2 innocent white children, orphaned by savage violence, have been stolen from their rightful heritage and subjected to heathen rituals that mock everything our society holds sacred." He gestured dramatically toward Running Bear, his finger pointed like an accusation. "This Apache warrior, and make no mistake, he's a warrior trained in the arts of killing, has used these vulnerable children's trauma to corrupt their young minds with superstitious nonsense. He has performed blasphemous ceremonies that our territorial laws explicitly prohibit. He has taught them to worship false gods and embrace savage customs that will forever mark them as outcasts from decent society." The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with settlers and townspeople crowding every available space. Most faces showed the hard suspicion that frontier life bred toward anything unfamiliar. But Running Bear's trained eye picked out scattered expressions of curiosity and even sympathy. The story had captured public imagination in ways that simple legal proceedings rarely managed. Father Santos rose to present the defense, his weathered face showing the calm authority of a man accustomed to speaking truth in hostile environments. Unlike Whitman's theatrical approach, the priest's manner was conversational, almost intimate, as if he were sharing a story with friends rather than arguing a legal case. "My friends," he began, his slight Spanish accent lending warmth to formal English, "I have spent 30 years working with children of many backgrounds, Apache, Mexican, Anglo, and those of mixed heritage who belong fully to none and partially to all. I have learned that the human heart recognizes love regardless of the color of skin that offers it. He turned to face the boys directly, his smile genuine and reassuring. 6 weeks ago, Jacob and Samuel Morrison were dying in the desert, abandoned by the very people who now claim exclusive right to determine their future. They were saved not by territorial officials or Christian missionaries, but by an Apache warrior who risked his own safety to offer aid to children of a different race. Father Santos walked slowly toward the jury box, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Since that rescue, I have observed these children weekly. I have tested their knowledge, evaluated their emotional health, and assessed the quality of care they have received. What I found challenges every stereotype and prejudice that drives this prosecution. From a leather portfolio, he withdrew documents that had been carefully prepared over the preceding weeks. Jacob Morrison, age 4, can now read simple English texts, perform basic arithmetic, and identify over 50 medicinal plants by sight. He has memorized biblical passages taught by his birth mother and Apache healing songs taught by his adoptive father. He shows no signs of psychological trauma and demonstrates remarkable emotional maturity for his age. The priest moved to his second set of documents. Samuel Morrison, also age 4, has recovered completely from the physical trauma of his ordeal and shows advanced understanding of natural sciences, basic medical principles, and conflict resolution techniques. Both boys speak English and Spanish fluently and are learning Apache language and customs. Their education is broader and more comprehensive than most children receive in our territorial schools. Whitman objected strenuously to the introduction of this evidence, arguing that academic performance was irrelevant to the central question of cultural corruption. But Judge Harrison Wells, a frontier veteran who had seen enough genuine corruption to recognize its absence, overruled the objection and allowed the testimony to continue. More importantly, Father Santos continued, these children show clear signs of attachment, security, and healthy emotional development. They have processed their parents' death with remarkable resilience and formed appropriate bonds with their new guardian. They are thriving, not merely surviving. He paused for effect, studying the faces of jurors who were beginning to look less certain about the prosecution's inflammatory claims. The question before this court is not whether Apache culture has value. That is a philosophical debate for another forum. The question is whether these specific children are better off now than they were when we found them dying in the desert. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests they are. Whitman's cross-examination of Father Santos revealed the political pressures driving the case. Under aggressive questioning, the priest admitted receiving pressure from territorial authorities to support the prosecution, pressure he had resisted based on his professional assessment of the children's welfare. Isn't it true, Father, that your mission receives territorial funding that could be jeopardized by your testimony here today? Whitman demanded. That threat has been made, yes, Father Santos replied calmly. But my oath as a priest requires me to speak truth, regardless of political consequences. These children are thriving under Apache care. To remove them now would constitute genuine abuse in service of racial prejudice. The statement sent murmurs through the crowded courtroom. Such direct challenges to territorial policy were rare, especially from respected religious figures, whose opinions carried weight with frontier communities. Judge Wells called for order, then made an unprecedented decision. This court will hear directly from the children involved. Bailiff, please escort Master Jacob Morrison to the witness stand. Jacob walked forward with the steady composure Running Bear had taught him, his small hand resting briefly on his medicine bundle for strength. At 4 years old, he was technically too young to testify under oath, but frontier courts operated with practical flexibility that Eastern legal precedents rarely allowed. Jacob, Judge Wells said gently, I want you to tell us about your life. Since your parents died, can you do that? Jacob nodded solemnly, then spoke with the clear articulation of a child accustomed to being listened to seriously. Running Bear found us when we were dying. He gave us water and medicine. He taught us songs that made the scary feelings go away. He promised never to leave us, and he kept his promise. "Are you happy living with Running Bear?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir. He teaches us important things every day. How to find clean water, how to make fire, how to help sick people feel better. He tells us stories about our mama and papa, and also stories about Apache ancestors. He says we can honor both families." Whitman's cross-examination attempted to portray the boy as a victim of sophisticated manipulation, but Jacob's responses showed no signs of coaching or confusion. When asked if he missed white people, he replied simply, "Sergeant Miller is white, and he visits us every week. Father Santos is Mexican, and he teaches us Spanish. We know lots of different kinds of people." Samuel's testimony proved even more compelling. The younger boy had always been more emotionally expressive than his brother, and his obvious affection for Running Bear was impossible to fake or misinterpret. When asked to describe his adoptive father, Samuel's face lit up with genuine joy. "He's the strongest person in the world," Samuel declared, "but he's never mean. When I have bad dreams about the rope and the hot sun, he sings me the healing songs until the dreams go away. He says I'm brave like the warriors in the old stories. Would you like to live with other white people instead?" Whitman asked, trying to plant seeds of doubt. Samuel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, then shook his head firmly. "Running Bear is our papa now. Apache law says so. We made promises to each other that can't be broken." The boy's reference to Apache law created a legal complication that Whitman hadn't anticipated. If the adoption ceremony had created legally binding relationships under Apache tribal law, the territorial court's authority to intervene became questionable. The question of jurisdictional sovereignty over Native American family matters was a complex issue that most frontier courts preferred to avoid. Running Bear's own testimony proved to be the case's turning point. Speaking in careful, formal English that demonstrated his education and intelligence, he methodically dismantled every argument the prosecution had presented. "Mr. Whitman speaks of corruption and brainwashing," Running Bear said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "But he has not visited our home. He has not observed the children's daily education. He has not witnessed their emotional healing or their growing strength and confidence." He turned to face the jury directly, a breach of courtroom protocol that Judge Wells allowed to continue. "These boys came to me broken in body and spirit. They had watched their parents die. They had been left to die themselves. They trusted no one because no one had proven trustworthy." Running Bear's scarred hands gestured toward Jacob and Samuel, who watched him with obvious love and pride. "Today they are whole children, secure in their identity, confident in their abilities, proud of both their birth heritage and their adopted culture. They speak multiple languages, understand different ways of seeing the world, and possess skills that will serve them well regardless of which community they choose to join as adults." He paused, gathering his thoughts for the statement that would define the case. Apache law recognizes that children belong not to any single race or culture, but to those who provide them with love, education, and preparation for adult life. These boys have chosen their family based on actions, not skin color. To overturn that choice would teach them that racial prejudice is more important than human love. The courtroom erupted in competing reactions, some spectators applauding, others shouting objections, while Judge Wells hammered for order. When silence finally returned, the tension was palpable. Everyone present understood that this case would set precedents affecting relations between Native Americans and territorial government for years to come. Whitman's closing argument relied heavily on fear and racial prejudice, painting apocalyptic pictures of white children growing up as savage warriors who would eventually turn against their own people. His rhetoric was inflammatory but effective with jurors who had personal experience of Apache raids and territorial conflicts. Father Santos delivered the defense's closing with quiet passion, focusing on the observable evidence of the children's welfare and the obvious sincerity of all parties involved. He reminded the jury that justice required decisions based on facts rather than fears, on individual circumstances rather than racial generalizations. As the jury retired to deliberate, Running Bear sat with his adopted sons in the courthouse hallway, teaching them a quiet hand-clapping game that helped pass time while managing anxiety. Their calm interaction provided a stark contrast to the heated emotions and political rhetoric that had dominated the formal proceedings. "What happens if they say we can't stay together?" Jacob asked, his young face showing worry despite his attempts to appear brave. Running Bear considered his answer carefully, understanding that children deserved honest preparation for difficult possibilities. "Then we will find another way to remain a family. Apache people have survived many attempts to separate us from those we love. We are patient and we are persistent." Samuel pressed closer to his adoptive father's side. "Will you fight for us?" "I am fighting for you right now," Running Bear replied. "Sometimes the strongest fighting happens in places like this, with words and truth instead of weapons. But yes, little warrior, I will always fight for our family." When the jury returned after 3 hours of deliberation, their faces revealed nothing of their decision. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Wells prepared to read the verdict that would determine not just the fate of 2 small boys, but the future of cross-cultural families throughout the territory. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, pregnant with possibilities that would reshape everything that came after. Judge Harrison Wells held the jury's written verdict in hands that had signed death warrants and territorial charters, had witnessed the rise and fall of boomtowns, had navigated the treacherous waters of frontier justice for over 2 decades. The paper trembled slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from the weight of a decision that would echo through history books and legal precedents for generations to come. In the matter of the Territory versus Running Bear, also known as Charlie Crow Feather, regarding the custody and care of minor children Jacob and Samuel Morrison, the judge began, his voice carrying across a courtroom, so silent that even the desert wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Running Bear stood with his hands resting lightly on his adopted son's shoulders, feeling their small bodies tense with anticipation. Jacob pressed closer to his left side, while Samuel gripped his hand with fingers that trembled despite his attempts at Apache stoicism. These boys had already survived the unthinkable. Now they waited to learn whether white man's law would tear apart the family that had grown from the ashes of their tragedy. The jury finds the defendant not guilty of unlawful custody of minor children. Judge Wells continued, and the courtroom erupted before he could finish reading the complete verdict. Cheers and angry shouts competed for dominance as spectators leaped to their feet, some embracing while others stormed toward the exits in disgust. But the judge's gavel cracked like thunder, demanding attention for the rest of his statement. Furthermore, this court officially recognizes the Apache adoption ceremony performed in accordance with tribal law as legally binding within territorial jurisdiction. The children Jacob Morrison and Samuel Morrison are hereby declared to be the legal sons of Running Bear, with all rights and protections that relationship entails. The second wave of reaction was even more explosive than the first. Prosecutor Whitman slammed his briefcase shut and stalked from the courtroom without a word, his political career effectively ended by a verdict that repudiated everything he represented. Father Santos crossed himself and whispered a prayer of gratitude in Spanish. Sergeant Miller, who had testified about the children's remarkable transformation, wiped tears from his weathered cheeks without shame, but the most profound reaction came from the boys themselves. Jacob, who had maintained careful composure throughout the proceedings, finally allowed himself to smile, not the cautious expression he had worn since his parents' death, but the radiant joy of a child who had found absolute security. Samuel simply buried his face against Running Bear's side and began to cry, releasing weeks of suppressed fear in a torrent of relieved tears. Running Bear knelt to embrace both his sons, speaking softly in Apache while the chaos continued around them. The words were ancient comfort songs, promises of protection and belonging that transcended language barriers. For the first time since that terrible day in the desert, they were truly safe, not just physically, but legally and socially recognized as a legitimate family. Judge Wells waited for relative quiet before delivering the most significant part of his ruling. This court also establishes a legal precedent for future cases involving cross-cultural adoption and child welfare. The standard to be applied will be the best interests of the children involved, regardless of racial or cultural considerations. Evidence of successful nurturing, education, and emotional development will take precedence over societal prejudices or political preferences. The precedent was revolutionary. For the first time in territorial history, a court had explicitly rejected racial considerations in favor of practical outcomes. Children's welfare would be measured by results rather than assumptions, by evidence rather than ethnicity. As the immediate celebration died down, Colonel Hayes approached the newly legal family with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal admiration. His political instincts had initially opposed the adoption, but watching the children's testimony and obvious well-being had convinced him that Running Bear represented something rare and valuable in the territory's development. "Charlie," Hayes said, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged equality rather than offering condescension, "I owe you an apology. I let political calculations cloud my judgment about what's right for those boys." Running Bear accepted the handshake, though his expression remained cautious. Years of dealing with white officials had taught him that today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy if political winds shifted. "Apologies are words," he replied diplomatically. "Actions matter more." "Fair enough," Hayes nodded. "Then let me offer action instead of words. The territorial government has authorized me to extend a formal invitation for you and your sons to establish permanent residence in any location of your choosing within our boundaries. You'll have access to territorial schools, medical facilities, and legal protections without surrendering your tribal affiliations or cultural practices." It was an unprecedented offer, the territorial government essentially recognizing a new category of citizen who could belong to both Apache and American legal systems simultaneously. The implications were staggering, potentially affecting thousands of Native Americans who had previously been forced to choose between tribal identity and territorial protection. But Running Bear's response surprised everyone who heard it. "I am honored by your offer," he said formally, "but my sons and I will be returning to Apache territory. There is work to be done among my own people, bridges to build between the old ways and the new realities." Hayes frowned, not understanding why anyone would reject the safety and opportunities that territorial citizenship provided. "Charlie, you've just won the right to raise those boys as full American citizens. They could attend university, pursue any profession, live anywhere in the country. Why would you take them back to the reservation where their opportunities will be limited?" Running Bear's scarred face showed the patient expression of a teacher addressing a well-meaning but confused student. "Colonel, you still think in terms of either or choices, Apache or American, tribal or territorial. But my sons represent something new. They are bridges between worlds, not refugees from one world seeking entry to another." He gestured toward Jacob and Samuel, who were accepting congratulations from Father Santos and several sympathetic spectators. "They will receive the best education possible, Apache wisdom and American knowledge, tribal traditions and territorial opportunities. When they are grown, they will choose for themselves which world to inhabit or perhaps they will create a new world that combines the best of both. The vision Running Bear articulated was breathtaking in its scope and optimism. Instead of cultural assimilation or stubborn isolation, he was proposing genuine integration, a future where different peoples could coexist while maintaining their distinct identities and contributing their unique strengths to a larger community. Over the following weeks, as news of the verdict spread throughout the territory and beyond, the story of the Apache warrior and his adopted white sons became a symbol of possibility rather than conflict. Newspaper articles portrayed Running Bear not as a noble savage or a dangerous renegade, but as a capable man who had responded to human need without regard for racial boundaries. The family's return journey to Apache territory became a processional of sorts, with stops at settlements and trading posts where curious crowds gathered to see the famous trio. What they found challenged every stereotype about both Apache culture and cross-racial families. The boys were clearly thriving, confident, articulate, and comfortable in their bicultural identity. Running Bear proved to be an engaging speaker who could discuss territorial politics, Apache traditions, and child-rearing philosophy with equal fluency. At one stop, a frontier schoolteacher named Margaret Chun challenged Running Bear's decision to take the boys away from civilized education. "How can you prepare them for modern life without proper schooling?" she demanded. Samuel, now 5 years old and increasingly articulate, answered before his adoptive father could speak. "We learn Apache medicine and American medicine," he said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone stating obvious truths. "We read English books and Spanish books and Apache picture stories. We know how to survive in the desert and how to behave in courtrooms. We're learning everything." Jacob added his own perspective with the philosophical insight that often emerged from children who had faced adult challenges. "Papa Running Bear says the world is big enough for all kinds of knowledge. We don't have to choose just one way of thinking." Their responses revealed the sophisticated education they were receiving, not just academic subjects, but critical thinking skills and cultural competency that prepared them for leadership in a complex, multicultural world. The transformation extended beyond the immediate family to the broader community as well. Father Santos used the legal precedent to establish new policies at his mission school, creating the first genuinely bicultural education program in the territory. Students learned their traditional languages alongside English and Spanish, studied their tribal histories as well as European American civilization, and developed skills relevant to both traditional and modern economic systems. Sergeant Miller requested transfer to the Apache reservation, where his military experience and newfound respect for Native American culture made him an effective liaison between tribal and territorial authorities. His reports back to military headquarters consistently emphasized the sophistication of Apache governance systems and the potential for peaceful coexistence based on mutual respect rather than forced assimilation. Even Colonel Hayes found his perspectives fundamentally altered by the experience. His subsequent reports to Washington included recommendations for policy changes that recognized tribal sovereignty while encouraging voluntary cultural exchange. He became an advocate for what he termed parallel development, allowing Native American communities to modernize on their own terms while maintaining access to territorial resources and opportunities. The most profound transformation occurred within Apache territory itself. Running Bear's success in navigating the white legal system while maintaining his cultural identity inspired other tribal members to engage more actively with territorial institutions. Young Apache men and women began seeking education that would prepare them to serve as cultural bridges, protecting their people's interests while adapting to changing circumstances. 3 years after the courthouse victory, Jacob and Samuel had become symbols of successful bicultural integration throughout the Southwest. Now 7 and 8 years old, respectively, they spoke 4 languages fluently, could navigate both Apache and American social systems with ease, and had developed leadership skills that impressed adults from both cultures. Their fame brought them to the attention of university professors and government officials who saw them as living proof that cultural differences could be bridged through education and mutual respect. Harvard University extended an unprecedented invitation for them to attend preparatory school and eventually college, with full scholarships and the promise that they could maintain their Apache cultural practices while receiving a world-class education. But when the offer was presented to Running Bear, he gathered his sons around the family fire for a serious discussion about their future. The decision would be theirs to make, but he wanted them to understand all the implications before choosing. This opportunity could open doors that have never been opened to Apache people, he explained as the desert stars wheeled overhead. You could become lawyers, doctors, teachers who help bridge our two worlds. You could speak for our people in places where Apache voices have never been heard. Jacob, now calling himself, stands between worlds in all but the most formal situations, considered the offer with mature seriousness. What would you want us to do, Papa? Running Bear smiled at the question, remembering his own youth when he had sought guidance from elders who seemed to have all the answers. I want you to follow the path that serves the greatest good, for yourselves, for our family, for our people, and for the larger world we all share. That path may lead to Harvard, or it may lead deeper into Apache territory, or it may lead somewhere none of us have imagined yet. Samuel, who had taken to calling himself Quiet Thunder, asked the question that went to the heart of their unusual situation. If we go to the white man's school, will we still be Apache? You will be what you choose to be, Running Bear replied. Apache identity comes from the heart, not from location. If your hearts remain connected to our people and our ways, you will be Apache whether you live in Cambridge or in the desert. But if you lose that connection, you will be lost no matter where your feet stand. The conversation continued deep into the night, touching on questions of identity, responsibility, and the nature of cultural belonging that philosophers had debated for centuries. But these weren't abstract philosophical discussions. They were practical decisions that would shape not just two young lives, but potentially the future relationship between Native American and European American civilizations. When dawn broke over the desert, the boys had reached their decision. They would accept Harvard's offer, but with conditions that reflected their unique perspective and responsibilities. They would spend summers and holidays in Apache territory, maintaining their connection to tribal life and traditions. They would study law and medicine not just for personal advancement, but with the explicit goal of returning to serve their people as cultural ambassadors and advocates. Most importantly, they would carry their Apache names and identity into whatever future they built, refusing to let success in the white world require abandonment of their adopted heritage. Years later, when Jacob Morrison Stands Between Worlds became the first Native American graduate of Harvard Law School, and Samuel Morrison Quiet Thunder earned his medical degree from Johns Hopkins, their success was celebrated in both Apache territory and American newspapers. But their greatest achievement wasn't personal advancement. It was the demonstration that cultural identity could be preserved and honored even while engaging fully with a larger, more complex world. Running Bear lived to see his adopted sons become leaders who bridged worlds he had never imagined they could reach. Jacob established the first law firm dedicated to Native American rights, winning landmark cases that protected tribal sovereignty while securing access to American legal protections. Samuel founded medical clinics that combined traditional Apache healing methods with modern scientific medicine, creating treatment approaches that proved more effective than either system alone. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the one that occurred in Running Bear himself. The scarred warrior who had once survived by staying invisible between worlds became a respected elder whose story inspired a generation of young people, both Native American and European American, to believe that differences in culture, race, and background could become sources of strength rather than division. On his deathbed, surrounded by his sons and their children, grandchildren who carried both Morrison and Apache bloodlines, who spoke multiple languages and belonged to multiple worlds without contradiction, Running Bear reflected on the desert day when he had found two dying children tied to a wagon wheel. He had thought he was saving their lives. What he had actually done was help create a new way of being, American, that didn't require anyone to surrender their deepest identity in order to belong to the larger community. The transformation that began with one Apache warrior's refusal to look away from suffering had rippled outward to reshape the very definition of family, citizenship, and cultural belonging in the American Southwest. It proved that the greatest victories weren't won through force or legislation, but through the patient, persistent demonstration that love could indeed transcend any boundary that fear and prejudice might construct. As the desert wind carried his spirit toward the sacred mountains where his ancestors waited, Running Bear's final gift to the world remained embodied in two remarkable men who had learned to carry their scars as badges of survival rather than marks of shame, who had discovered that true strength came not from choosing between worlds, but from building bridges strong enough to connect them all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.